Great. Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction, Margie, and thank you, Gold Country Writers, for inviting me back again. We're doing something slightly different than the last time, which was narrative structure, but I gotta warn everybody, there's a lot of content. So I'm going to try to take it at a good pace, but there is a lot of content in this. Fortunately, there's a recording, so if you get a little overwhelmed, you can go back and reference to it. And we'll go ahead and get started. So as Margie mentioned, I am an animator turned author. Those are very different creative disciplines. One is about drawings, the other one is about words. But funnily enough, when I was writing or learning how to write, I would find myself falling back onto the principles of animation to help guide me to better creative solutions to whatever plot problems or character arc issues I might have. Ultimately, after having done both roughly about the same time, I started writing about 10 years, and I've been trained for animation for about 4 years and worked in the industry for about the same amount. I find that in the end, creative writing and animation deal in the same currency, which is ultimately believability. So this is why I decided to create this lecture, basing the principles of narrative believability, which is actually based on the foundations of animation, which is the 12 principles of animation. Okay, so first, some definitions, because what is believability? Essentially, believability is the quality of being able to be believed, credibility. When specifically referenced to a fictional character or situation, the quality of being convincing or realistic. Well, that is being believable. Then there's being a narrative, right, which is a spoken or written account of connected events, a story. If we quote Edward R. Murrow, who's a very famous journalist, to be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. So essentially, believability is truth, but not based on hard facts, right? We're trying to essentially evoke something that's just as real as a real experience. It's a very broad concept, so that's why we're going to kind of focus on narrative. Now, believability is something that is kind of applicable to every aspect of your work, creative work. Whether it's the narrative, the plot, the description, the setting, the characters, the arcs, whatever it is. It's a kind of a universal concept. We're just focusing on narrative specifically. But even when you work in nonfiction, believability is still a really key aspect. So if you work into journalism, it's the same concept. You can have a lot of dry facts. If you don't interconnect them in a way that makes sense to the reader, it's not going to work. And people are not going to believe it, even if it is actually true. Hence the whole moon landing thing, right? People don't believe in the moon landing. So why believability is important, because you get people who are like, well, why is this really relevant? It's not really part of my story or my message. Essentially, believability engages a reader's sense to immerse them into the story, and it creates reader logic to convince the reader to take the story seriously. It allows the reader to make a connection between the story and their own lived experience, their real life. So I have the same quote on the bottom here. Now taking them each point. So by nature, books, movies, whatever media you form is a sense-limited medium. Essentially, we have 5 senses, some say 6, right? And when you're living your experience, you have all these senses and all this input telling you what you're going through. But when you're reading a book, you're down to one sense. You're down to the visual sense. And in that visual sense, it still has to trigger the same level of intensive emotion in the reader's mind. You're essentially relying on the reader's imagination to fill in those sensory gaps. That's why when you get a lot of feedback, some people get feedback, they're all like, or if you read a text and you're like, someone gets stabbed and there's a squish and you're just like, oh, I can like feel the squish, or there's been an explosion, I can smell the gunpowder. You're essentially using words to evoke those other things, but there is always a gap because you're using one sense to fill in for at least 5, right? Okay, so that's what we talk about when we're talking about immersing the reader into the story. We're trying to fill those sensory gaps. And you use believability in order to do that. For the second one, humans are generally pretty cautious species. We're pretty smart, we're pretty observant. We use all our senses to figure out what situation we're in, whether it's dangerous or not. And a big part of that is whether we believe what we see is true. We're really visually dependent as a species, and we want to make sure what we see is actually real or not. You get those people who look on every VFX movie and they go, that cloud's not real, or that dust's not real, or there's no way a person can be green and monstrous and blow up buildings. Like, they get so fixated on the idea of real. Or I get people who are like, I don't read science fiction because it's not real. I hate to break it to you, Jason Bourne's not real either. You know, 007's not real either. But they can read those, they can read Crime Thriller, but they can't read, I don't know, The Winds of Time or something like that. So you kind of gotta like get a sense of what is convincing them to take those stories seriously. When we convince people to take the story seriously, then we get them to commit to whatever it is, the circumstances of that story, be it in space or be it, you know, in some town that's got a chemistry teacher or something along those lines. So when we're talking about making believability lend itself towards the audience, we really want them to take that story seriously. And therefore, they will commit and they will be able to engage their imagination. When we talk about allowing the reader, on the third point, make a connection between their story and the real life. So I'm a firm believer that stories are tools of communication. Really, there's no point in telling a story unless there's a recipient, right? So you gotta think of them as a bit of a handshake. We, the authors or the writers, are writing a bunch of words to try to communicate or elicit a response from the reader, okay? So the more you can kind of get their commitment, the more they can convince them that the story you're talking about is real, the better that handshake and the tighter it's going to be. The less you're likely going to lose them in the audience, right? Because you're making a connection between the two things. And believability has a really strong part of it. We are ultimately all human, right? We all have certain experiences. We've all been born, we've probably all cried, we've probably all felt pain. We've had certain universal things that we've experienced just for being on this planet together. And through these words, by being able to connect those experiences between mine and yours, we'll be able to get them to commit and take the story seriously and believe and immerse them into the same world. So these are the things that, like, why believability is super important, because it will essentially create that handshake, and the more you can get that down, the more the reader is less likely to put your story down or decide that they don't really want to read about space cowboys. They'd really rather read about other cowboys in real life, whatever that means, because no cowboy story I've ever heard of is actually that realistic. So, how to achieve believability. How many people have heard this term, suspension of disbelief? We've all kind of heard this suspension of disbelief. So suspension of disbelief is kind of how we convince the readers, how we create believability. It's not by creating disbelievability, it's actually the reverse. We have to get them to do is to suspend their disbelief, which is to temporarily allow themselves to believe something that isn't true, especially in order to enjoy a work of fiction. Like, this alien's like, you know, this isn't real. Do you ever get that? You sit somebody with a movie theater and they're like, this isn't real, this couldn't happen. It's like, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. You just enjoy this experience. So the term suspension of disbelief, or willing to suspension of disbelief, has been defined as a willingness to suspend one's critical faculties and believe the unbelievable. Sacrifice of realism and logic for the sake of enjoyment, right? That is the whole kind of point of fiction, and in some arguments, nonfiction, because there are some nonfiction stories that are stranger than fiction. I read this amazing naturalist and the elephant whisperer and his connection with the elephants. This is a true story, but it sounds so fantastical. It really sucks you into it. So, you know, this is actually a very old idea. This was originally developed in the 1800s, this idea of suspending disbelief. And it was talking about how there was a rise of fiction during that time of period. And basically, if we break it down to it, what they're talking about is that if the story is good enough and convincingly humanistic enough, the audience is willing to accept that a work of fiction can still be considered true, even if the whole thing is fabricated. A great example is, it's kind of a weird example, but how many people have heard of Little House on the Prairie? Yeah. Everybody's heard of Little House on the Prairie, right? If you read Little House on the Prairie, in theory, it is the story of the author's lived experience, Laura Ingalls Wilder. But it's actually a work of fiction. It's not her actual experience. You can read her actual experience. There's an amazing book, I think it won a Pulitzer, called Pioneer Girl, which breaks down the original story of her actual autobiography. And if you compare the two, they're quite starkly different. There are made-up characters in Little House on the Prairie that never existed in her real life. And yet, if you ask what would give a really accurate and realistic picture of what pioneer life was during the late 1800s, most people are going to go to Little House on the Prairie. So despite the fact that ultimately the work is a piece of fiction, it still rings very true for over 100 years now, right? So this is what we're talking about. Or you can create fiction that people can't even tell is fiction. It's so true. In animation, we have something very similar. We talk about believability a lot. We talk about suspending the disbelief, because ultimately when we're talking about animation, it's a bunch of drawings. Spoiler alert. We do about 24 drawings per second. They're just line and paper. There's nothing creating it. And yet, even though we are essentially drawing tens of thousands of pictures, if you flip them together, they look alive. Not only do they look alive, they look like beloved characters that people obsess over, that people are inspired by, that they latch onto, they can identify with. I use the genie as a great example here. He is really fictional, okay? Not even close to real. He's a drawing. First of all, he's blue. Second of all, and he's a mythical creature. He's a genie. And yet the genie is an iconic character. He has been for, decades and generations at this point. So when we talk about characters like the genie, how do we bring him to life? Essentially, animators are given a rubric. We have 12 principles of animations. These 12 principles were developed by two of Walt Disney's original classic animators, the 9 old men, we style them. So Frank Thompson and Ollie Johnston were the men who wrote a book called The Illusion of Life. Very useful if you want to learn about how to bring characters to life. They don't talk just about the technical aspect of things. They go into like the story and how Walt Disney and Disney Animation kind of came up with these principles and came up with ways to make their films. Really useful, but we call it the animation Bible in a lot of ways, but it's very great. So they developed these 12 principles. People here, you probably don't draw, right? So it's okay. That's okay. We're not an animation class. We're in writing. Oh yeah, we have one amazing animator, but you guys are probably not too keen on starting that track. That's a whole different journey trying to become an animator. If you're in writing, we can apply the 12 principles of animation to writing, but it's going to look technically a little bit different, and it's going to be a less exercise of how to make drawings move and have follow through and overuse and secondary action and all that kind of thing. What you're really looking for is the base principles underneath those things, why those things are applicable to fiction. Okay? So when we're talking about books, again, we only have one. In animation, at least we've got sound. Okay, we've got visual and sound. But books, we only got words. That's it. But that doesn't mean that books lose by any stretch of the means. We have been writing fiction for much longer than we've had film. So as Stephen King says, books are a uniquely portable magic. It's a magic that you can bring around with you everywhere you go. And I have a quote from Herman Melville for the first few words, which is "Call me Ishmael." The words have been resounding in history for well over 100 years at this point, talking about the mythical white whale Moby Dick. So ultimately, I mean, Moby Dick is about a story about a turning mad sea captain chasing a white whale, and yet this piece of fiction, which I'm sorry is a little bit dreary, but this piece of fiction has actually captured imaginations for, decades, centuries, and it will continue. It keeps getting reiterated over and over again. And so clearly words can create a believability so strong that it persists across time. It's just a matter of how you do it, right? Actually, I have a friend who's having a retelling version of Moby Dick in space, and that's supposed to come out in 2026. So like I said, you kind of see the same things over and over again. So words still have power. You don't need the sound, you don't need the dancing genie. If you choose your words carefully, you will be able to have the same power to transcend time and space, to bridge that gap between you and your reader. Okay, here's the big ugly word in the room, realism. Realism, we get this a lot, realism. How many people here write fiction? Everybody? And then people are writing nonfiction? Okay, or both. So, there's always kind of a little bit of fight, right, between the fiction and the nonfiction. Tussle, ding. So with nonfiction, you're kind of looking at the facts, you're structuring it in a way that's digestible for the audience, right? In fiction, you kind of got to make all that stuff up on your own. And every once in a while, you run into readers or people who talk about like, well, if it's not real, I'm not interested. Has anybody ever I run into this every once in a while. I get people who are like, you write science fiction? It's not real, like why would it matter? Yeah, right, like why would it matter? And it's like, well, realism is kind of not the end-all and be-all of everything. I mean, myths are not real. I'm sorry, there's no Zeus with a lightning strike, or maybe there is, I don't know. I'm not that elevated to find out whether the Greek gods are real or not. But we're talking about realism and believability. So I write science fiction. It's very fantastical, right? Science fiction is really fantastical. I don't really have to worry about realism so much, right? I just have to worry about the fiction side. But let's say you write contemporary fiction. Let's just say you write medical or thriller or crime thriller or mystery or those kind of things, and you have realism versus believability. And how do you bridge that line? Like, how do you figure that out? Well, here's a spoiler alert. You don't actually have to worry about it as much as you think you do. Here are 2 examples of films and pieces of work that you probably would have thought were reversed. So the top 2 are from a show you probably have all heard of called Grey's Anatomy. Grey's Anatomy is not a science fiction or fantasy piece of work. It is a drama, a medical drama set in a very realistic hospital in Seattle. And yet, it's very, very common for Grey's Anatomy to use green screens and VFX to film their show. Right, it's very interesting, right? Actually, this is true for a lot of shows. Emily in Paris, what else was it? Ugly Betty was also filmed very much with green screens. So you would think that they would be moving everybody to the location, but no, they actually use they employ a lot of VFX. Practically 90% to 95% of the shots you see on any television show is got green screen involved, even if it's a drama. It's just locations, it's easier for them to film it on a stage. Green screen technology is really advanced nowadays, AI. So it makes it a little bit easier for them to do that, it's more cost effective. The bottom 2, you'll notice, has anybody seen the film Inception, Christopher Nolan's film for quite a while ago? I do highly recommend this film. It is an amazing, even if you don't like science fiction, it's an amazing piece of film work. So Inception is a science fiction film. I'm just going to give you a brief rundown because it seems like a lot of people haven't seen it, where Leonardo DiCaprio essentially goes into people's minds and messes with them a little bit. And because he's in people's minds, they twist the camera. Who's seen 2001 Space Odyssey? Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece? Okay. Yeah. Very similar kind of camera techniques. Christopher Nolan is a genius. He's got really amazing film work. And he does a similar thing where in the Space Odyssey you have the revolving walking form, right? Christopher Nolan does very similar things where he has this hallway basically turning and this massive fight scene. Look it up on YouTube, it's amazing. Just look up the Inception fight sequence. So if you watch that piece of film, you would think that there's a lot of CG involved to get this hallway to turn and mess with all the dimensions. Except there wasn't. Christopher Nolan is very, very dedicated towards practical effects. If you watch his films, which that includes the Batman series, right? Inception's another one. What was the other one? Where we go, space. Oh. Interstellar, right? And then he just did another film. But most of his films try really, really hard to use practical effects. To the point that for this fight sequence, they spent weeks building 2 rotating hallways. If you look on the picture with the framework, that is the rotating hallway. And poor Joseph Gordon-Levitt had to practice fighting in this fight sequence for about 3 weeks to get this film shot. So you see him standing inside the actual hallway with the camera rig that's staying still. And that hallway is actually turning and twisting while he's in this fight sequence. It is an entirely practical effect. The only thing that's CG is there's wires, because if they make a mistake, he can fall 20 feet. So there's some wires, they wired that out, Crouching Tiger style. But otherwise, everything else in the film is actually practical effects. So when we talk about realism versus believability, it doesn't really matter, right? If you make it believable enough, it will feel real. It just depends on what kind of techniques you want to use to do that. Do you want to do, a green screen effect? Do you want to build a practical effect? It's your choice. You're the creator. You get to choose. But this is what I'm trying to say. Realism is actually kind of secondary, right? That's an emotional response. It's a question of what you give them. The believability, if you do that successfully, you will be able to make the reader feel like it's real, regardless of whether that's true or not. So getting down to the nitty-gritty 12 principles. Don't be in a rush to write these down. I'm going to list and define each one of these for you. Oh, first I'm going to ask, does anybody have any questions? Are we good for now? Everybody's okay? Okay, great. 12 principles of believability. I came up with these on my own. Nobody else does this. So you're my test audience. And so we're going to go into it. So first off, I've kind of gotten them broken up where they're somewhat related. Where it's like setting, consistency, history, and then we've got cause, effect, layers, contradiction, flaws, specificity, exaggeration, pacing, weighted decision making, and subplots. Okay, we're going to go through each one of these individually because it's helpful that way. Setting. Everybody's heard of setting, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, we all have heard of setting. A setting or backdrop is the time and geographic location within a narrative, either nonfiction or fiction. Setting is super critical to everybody's narrative fiction. You kind of want to get them to sort of jive, right? Every play needs a stage, and that's exactly what the setting does for the story. Successful setting will do more than tell the reader when something is or where the story takes place. It will also provide the main emotional and societal backdrop as well as the overall mood for the story. So elements of the setting may include culture, historical period, geography, specific time markers. And it's important to note that settings can shift over the course of the story due to the passage of time and also, teleporting with your characters, right, if they've moved locations. And the changes should flow with the story as well as reflect the key plot points. So we have two examples here. They're both taken from J.R.R. Tolkien's body of work. The one, I guess that would be on your right, would be a description of Bilbo Baggins' home, right? So we have, I'm going to read it out. So in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozing smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Very brief little description talking about Bilbo Baggins, but what do we learn about Bilbo Baggins because of this being his hobbit hole? Well, for one thing, he knows it doesn't have worms or an oozing smell, and certainly his house is not empty or anything to eat. It's not empty of fridge, it's not an empty sofa. It's a comfortable place, right? Where you're in a cozy, comfortable place. As opposed to that, same world, in the Fellowship of the Ring, we're talking about Sauron's tower, right? Then at last his gaze was held, wall upon wall, battlement upon battlement, black, immeasurably strong mountain of iron, gate of steel, tower of adamant. He saw it, Barad-dûr, fortress of Sauron. All hope left him. Yeah. These are very emotional descriptions, and they really set the story. You have a huge contrast, right, between Bilbo Baggins and Sauron. So you really kind of gotta fit the narrative, or fit the setting to where the story is going to take place, which is ultimately, these are two descriptions of an even bigger setting called Middle-earth, right? Middle-earth has tons of different locations. And doing so makes it really easy for us, one, to kind of paint the picture of where the story is taking place in our head, and two, to get a better understanding of the characters, but most importantly, also the challenges of what the hobbits have to go through in order to be able to get to the end of the story. And that's really critical. We call that what? Setting up the stakes, right? You hear this a lot in fiction, setting up the stakes. And so what kind of goes wrong if the setting, so we're talking about believability, right? So what goes wrong if the setting doesn't really match? Well, you're going to break the reader's suspension of disbelief, right? My example for you is if you have something mismatched, like a hard-nosed former murderer turned noir detective is solving a crime in a Disney princess world. It's probably not going to go so well, right? Ironically, there is a film that kind of is like that. Does anybody know what it's called? Who heard of Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yeah.
It's a noir detective story set in Toontown. But you'll notice which tunes they used. They didn't use Cinderella in that one. They used Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, the more harder, edgier characters, Mickey Mouse makes one little appearance, I was shocked. But generally speaking, they still have to kind of, you know, Jessica Rabbit, she looks like she's a femme fatale, right? The ultimate femme fatale. So even though we've still merged really different backgrounds, they're still very careful to make sure that the setting matches the characters, that it matches the story. Otherwise, people are really not going to buy into this. Movie magic helps, okay? Even though that's actually a book, you can look it up. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? I know. The more you learn.
Yeah.
Consistency! Who's heard of this term? Consistency in fiction, right? Okay. So consistency is a conformity in the application of something. Typically that which is necessary for the sake of logic, accuracy, or fairness. So it should go without saying, consistency is the cornerstone for keeping a story believable. Yeah? In its broadest sense, we're talking about the consistency of a physical world. So things like Star Trek does not have sound in space, but Star Wars does. Does anybody notice that? Yeah, it's pretty common knowledge. And so the one of the most important things about consistency is that the elements presented in the story kind of must stay the same, unless there's a believable reason for the element to change. And that's not limited to external consistency, okay? That also operates on internal journeys of your character. For example, if you have somebody who's afraid of snakes, like me and Indiana Jones, unless you deliberately show them overcoming that fear, you cannot have them terrified of a garter snake in one scene and then wrestling a rattlesnake in another scene like a rubber hose, right? That's gonna make people go, that doesn't look right. Something is not jiving here. And then snapping out of the suspension of disbelief, right? Once you've done that, it's really hard to get them back into it. So, how many people have watched the film Gravity? No, not some people. Yeah, with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. That's right, George Clooney. Spoiler alert, I used to do space settlement engineering in high school. Sounds very posh. I was at NASA. We punched a hole. It's a whole other story. But I worked in some space stuff on the sideline for high school. And when I watched Gravity, there was this moment, I don't know if anybody else knows about it, but there's this moment where there's this dramatic moment between Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, and they're holding on, and then he releases himself so that she can, like, you know, save herself. Yeah, the problem with that's not how physics works in space, right? Spoiler alert. The minute that happened, I was done. That film was over for me. I couldn't watch it anymore. It actually bothered me so much how well it did in the theaters. Because I was sitting there going like, the force is already gone. Newton's law would have taken over. She could have just reeled him in. Ironically, they did it correctly in The Martian, but they didn't do it correctly in Gravity. I know, space is funny like that. So it's like, normally it wouldn't be a terrible problem. Like I said, there's sound in Star Wars, right? But when your whole film is based on the challenges of space, that becomes a big problem, right? When you break that kind of hard line believability metric right there. So really, it's very difficult for me to even look at this film. Actually, even just getting this slide was tough for me because I was like so disgusted by like how badly the physics was, right? So this shows you the importance of consistency and these external forces. I don't really love bringing this up because J.K. Rowling is extremely problematic, but I'm going to say, because it's a negative, Harry Potter's magic system makes no sense. Okay? There is no consistency at all. The entire thing is driven by what's convenient for the plot.
That's true.
You know? Why is it that all the adults graduate at Hogwarts, they can do this amazing magic, but then Ron and Hermione are useless when it comes to the magic front? It's very odd, right? So there's a lot of things that are in there, like the time turner is all convenient for the plot. Never dealt with again, this hugely powerful device, so she can take tests. It's not consistent. So when you actually sit down and look at it and break it down, it really doesn't make tons of sense. So these kind of things that bothered me. Again, I'm not a fan of Harry Potter for that reason, way before J.K. Rowling was a problem. Just because the magic was really, really inconsistent. So if you sit down and think about the things that you do enjoy, ask yourself, how many elements of consistency are we seeing? I mean, if the hobbits, going back to the hobbits, if the hobbits suddenly became like raving honey badger level fighters, we'd all be sitting there going, when did that happen, right? Like, they do get to be better fighters, but for the most part, they're better dodgers, and they continue to be good dodgers throughout the entire work. They don't ever really take on anything powerful head on. They'll get like a knee jab in and then run away. That's kind of like the peak of their fighting prowess. So there is development. We see the hobbits develop, especially Merry and Pippin. They do actually like tussle in a little bit. But you don't see them toppling a giant by themselves, right? Usually they keep something occupied until someone bigger and stronger comes in and finishes them off. Aragorn, he's really hot. It's great. Here you go. History. I apologize ahead of time. This is the only image I could find. It is AI generated. Disclaimer point, but it is what it is. We're in 2024. So history is the next principle, and we all know what history is, right? So a whole series of past events connected with someone or something. So we have our world, our setting. We have our rules for both the character and our plot, which we'll hopefully keep consistent unless there's a reason not to. So we're off to the races, right? Unfortunately, no, not quite yet, because there's context, right? And the context of the story, the context of our characters, the context of the elements of the story are grounded in their history. Now, history has to be, kind of consistent with all these other elements. I see this a lot, actually, in my editing work, where these characters come in and they're like Athena. They were sprouted from the mind of the writer, fully formed. And I don't know anything about their childhood. I don't know anything about their history, what their school life was like, who their friends were before the story happened, who their parents were. If they didn't have parents, how did they survive without parents, Because we as humans all kind of have similar things. Like regardless of whether you're with your birth parents or not, you've had parents, right? Or if you had some kind of caregiver or some other element to reach adulthood, or not adulthood, however it is, just to get past the newborn phase, right? We've had relationships, even if it's a romance and they fall in love right off the bat. There's been other relationships before that period of time. There's friends or enemies or, annoyances, it depends. Siblings, wider family relationships, or it could be an orphanage, wherever you grew up with the orphanage, etc., etc., etc. So the history of the character is really critical. They have to act according to that history, right? And not only that, there's a history of the place. If we're going to take an example, I'm going to use Oliver Twist, even though I don't know much about Oliver Twist. He's an orphan, so he doesn't have parents. That part's easy, right? But he has a parish that's taking care of him, and the parish has their policies on how to deal with him, which is to not feed him. And then he has to suffer under those things, and he's hungry, and so he goes, please sir, can I have some more? That didn't go down well. And so ultimately that catapulted him out onto the streets, right? That's how he gets to the streets of London, and he meets all these other people. And on one hand, Oliver Twist is very innocent and naive because he's only known the parish and the church and everything like that and the magistrate. And on the other hand, he's not that stupid because, he's been hungry. And so the whole story kind of comes into that. And if Oliver Twist suddenly was in the parish, doing his thing, hungry, goes on the streets, and then becomes, the son of the prime minister, becomes really rich and starts eating mutton every day. That would be really weird, right? Like, that doesn't quite jive with his history. So you want to make sure that there is a history and that it applies. Let's just say you have the same character, Oliver Twist, and you bring him to the 21st century, right? He's in modern day era. He's probably not going to have the same orphanage experience, right? We probably can't have his character starving in the orphanage, at least not physically starving, right? We would have to have given him enough food. So what would he be lacking then in the 21st century? Probably love. He'd be starving for love. He wouldn't be starving for food. So he'd be starving for love. So we have to kind of adjust things based on our setting and our context to give him the correct history to match with our story, right? So you see how all these three elements kind of work together to create a realm of believability. If I brought Oliver Twist to 2021 and I put him in an orphanage in New York, let's just say, and then I starved him, I don't think people are going to believe me too well that I've somehow created this starving kid. You'll notice all the starving kid orphans are kind of in the 1900s. Lemony Snicket's another great example of starving orphans. We don't really do that so much in 2024, right? So we have to come up with other things, other elements to work to make it jive with the history of the story. Because again, we're also very suspicious. So we went back to the humans being suspicious thing, right? Let's just say you have a stranger roll up, and I know nothing about the stranger. That stranger is my protagonist, okay, let's just say. And They're working really fast, and then we're like, they never talk, they never say anything. Their dress is, I don't know, just a white suit or something. And I'm sitting there looking, I'm like, I don't really know how much I want to know about this person because I'm not seeing any input, right? The strangers kind of like really take notice. So our imagination starts going really wild, right? Let's just say that I have somebody coming in, they're so drab. You have one of those everyday man faces in a plain black and white. I'm like, let's just make it even more generic for America. He's wearing a white button shirt with the top button unbuttoned. He's wearing khaki pants. Can't get more generic than that, right? Brown hair, glasses, that's it. That's all I got for this person walking towards me. And I'm looking at him like, I don't have any context for you, dude. Like, I don't know where you came from, right? What happens at that point? Your imagination starts going wild, right? You're like, oh, maybe that's like Jeanette's cousin. No, Jeanette's cousin's like not from there. Maybe this guy is like an investigator for the CIA or something, right? Or like maybe he's a weatherman. Maybe is there a tornado like coming out? Your imagination starts going way wild. The dude's a shoe salesman, okay? We don't know that. So when you don't give enough history and context and details, what happens is you're giving your reader the freedom to go hog wild. And they will do that. And so then what happens? You take them along the plot, and it's like, I don't know, John Doe goes into the shoe store, ding-a-ling-a-ling, like, would you like to buy some shoes? Man, I thought this guy was going to be way more exciting than that, right? And so now what's happened? I've broken my believability. Boom, the reader's out of the story. They're not interested so much anymore, okay? So if I provide the proper context, John Doe comes up with his like, you know, generic white 90s Camry. It's gold, it's old. He's got a pile of old shoes, you know, marker's been slashed onto the boxes. They don't have the correct, you know, they've been on sale, they've been discounted so many times, like the whole label is black now, right? He's got clean pants, but his shoes are old. He's not even using his own shoes, right? Guy looks really beaten and downtrodden. His coffee cup is like full of 7-Eleven coffee cups, which is like really grody, and he hasn't had time to clean out. The whole thing smells like old coffee and donut crumbs, right? Now we've got an idea of what's happened to this guy, right? He's a traveling shoesman. He's not doing too hot. He's rolling into town hoping for a good deal. Now I'm not thinking so much that he's some like, you know, weatherman or mystery spy or CIA agent or any of those things. I have context and I have some sense of his history. So those are the kind of things that you want to add into the story to prevent them from having what I like to call the Athena effect, which is like sprouted onto your brain only for the story, right? They exist only in the story. You want them to exist outside of the story, beyond just that. Otherwise, we're too suspicious to believe you. Cause and effect. So cause and effect is a principle that talks about the direct relationship between an action or event and its consequence or result. I use, this is you know, a broad lecture. If you give a mouse a cookie, the whole book is about cause and effect. Everybody know, if you give a mouse a cookie, right, he's going to want a glass of milk? Okay. So if you give a mouse a cookie, I spelled booze for some reason. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk, right? Written by Laura Nermal. Classic story. What does this essentially mean? We are creating a cause and effect where we are basically showing a kind of a playbook for the reader, being like, X happened, and then Y happened, and then X happened, and then Y happened, and interconnecting the cause and the effect aspect relationship of it makes them more interconnected, okay?
This is interesting because they use this for problem solving.
Exactly.
And team building.
Exactly, because we as humans love to do this. We love to figure out the cause and effect of something, right? Where do you think Zeus came from? Lightning struck! What is this thing? We don't know what lightning is, we have no clue. So what do? Well, we're gonna come up with something. There's a god out there and he's got this lightning bolt and he's angry at me, so he struck it down. Is that actuality? Not as far as I know, right? So we love to, as humans, we love to problem solve these things. We love to figure out why. Why did something happen, okay? We love to know. That's the whole reason we read stories. Why does something happen? What's gonna happen next, right? So, knowing that we as humans love to do this, we as writers have to give them those puzzle pieces and have them put it together themselves. You don't want to spoon feed it everything because then they get bored. We want to give them these puzzle pieces so that you go, oh look, there's a cause, and then the reader's like, what's the effect? And then you give them the effect, they're like, whoa, right? Like, that works out great. So that's really what we're trying to do. Humans love to make connections between things. And so whether it's real or not is kind of irrelevant, really. You're satisfying that aspect of their brain by solving the problem for them, or presenting them a problem that they can actually solve. Yes?
So when a person's writing a mystery and they're putting those red herrings, do you have to answer as the writer, do you have to answer every red herring? Or can you let some of them just go?
So with red herrings, okay, in mystery, on one hand, technically, no, you don't have to. But ask yourself about all the mysteries you've ever read and the red herrings you've encountered. I'm going to guess that the red herrings that somehow relate back to the main story, even though they're red herrings, are going to feel better. Right? Like, even if it's a red herring, that red herring having some, even if it's the wrong answer, that wrong answer having some kind of relevance to the rest of the story will provide more satisfaction on the part of the reader. If you just have a red herring show up and then toss that thing out to the sea and never mention it again, you're going to get some readers who are like, what happened to this thing? And next thing you know, you're going to be accused of plot holes. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant, right? Because readers today, in 2024, are much more sophisticated than readers back in the 1900s. They've seen everything, okay? And so that's would be the answer to my questions. Do you technically have to do it? Not for every single one, but I would recommend trying to do it as much as possible. I kind of call it the Zen effect, where like you gotta, everything that you introduce in the story should be somewhat interconnected to something else within the main plot. That will give more satisfaction to your reader. So whether it's true or not, or whether it's realistic or not, is not really so relevant so much as the satisfaction of it. Think of it like a Twinkie. Oh, Twinkie's a terrible example, but I'm gonna use it anyway. So like just think, everything's artificial. In a Twinkie, right? But it's sweet, and the flavors go together. So even though everything is artificial, and nobody really wants to eat what's in a Twinkie, do people finish them? They do. Do they feel satisfied? For now, up until they get sick. But it does the job at that moment. So all the more elements you can kind of tie together back to your main plot, the better, because you can create a greater sense of satisfaction. Otherwise, it becomes more distraction than a red herring, and that's the thing you want to avoid. Does that help?
Yeah.
So let's see. So if you make stories have more connections, they actually also become really believable. Here's a great example is like, you know, again, humans love to make connections, right? A black cat crossed my path, and then I tripped. So the black cat must belong to a witch and cursed me. I mean, it makes no sense when you sit down and think about it. And yet this is a perpetual urban myth, right? That black cats are bad luck, or like, you know, you smash a mirror and it's bad luck. It has nothing to do with reality. So what we're trying to say here is that the cause and effect have to kind of drive in a way that leads the reader down the way you want them to lead. Like if there's a path that you want to take the reader down, you want to use your cause and effects to make sure they take that path and not some other path. Or if you are trying to, in the case of mystery, if you are trying to diverge them down a path away from the answer, it's the same thing. You use a cause and effect to really double down on that red herring, so that you really convince the reader, like, oh, it could have been this. And then when they find out it's not, that like aha movement, like, oh, I've been foiled, they love it. They love to be tricked like that. Readers absolutely love it. Audiences love it. They love to not really know what's going on. Okay. So we're moving on. Everybody okay? Is this not too fast? We're all good? Okay, just checking in. We're on layers. So the layers definition is pretty drab, to be honest. It's a sheet or a quantity of thickness of material, typically one or several, covering a surface or a body. So when we're talking about layers, right, we're talking about literary layers. And literary layers have lots of elements. I can't go through all of them. That'd be a whole lecture just by itself, talking about all the different layers that you can put into your story. For the purpose of this lecture, the key point is that there should be layers. They have to exist, whether it's in your character, in your setting, character action, in decisions, whatever it is. Now, when you talk about just talking about history, setting, consistency, or cause and effect, those are all layers. These are the layers we're talking about, right? So when we're talking about history and context and culture, Those are all layers. Those are all the layers of things that you want to introduce into your fiction to make it more believable, because we're not just we don't live in one dimension. We live in 3 dimensions. Some argue 4 or 5 dimensions, depending on how you want to gauge time, right? So knowing that our lived experience, remember the sensory thing? We only have one sense to convey an entire lived life through our fiction. Well, you have to somehow use layers to create additional dimensions for that experience, right? So like, if I only have words, I have to use those words to elicit an idea of sight and sound and smell and touch and feel. Like, so those are the layers you need to add into your fiction to create a full experience, right? A full, real 3D experience, okay? You have to be kind of careful with them. How many people have tried 3D, like 3D goggles or 3D glasses? How many people have been on any kind of ride or simulation where there's like 3D glasses, or been to a 3D movie, right? How many people have been sick on one of those things? Right? I used to work at Disneyland, spoiler alert, and we would get a lot of people who were very motion sick from the 3D glasses and the additional movement. So you have to be kind of judicious about how you want to do your layers, because you don't really want to make people ill or turn them off either. Great example is, I know editors who will absolutely not accept any books that start with or describe viscerally puking, vomiting. It's just an immediate turn off. It's such a negative experience for so many people that once it shows up on the page, they're like, no, we're done. So, yes?
But I have just noticed that there are a tremendous number of books, including children's books, where one character has to vomit at least once or twice a day.
Oh, I know. I have children. I have an 8 and 11-year-old. They love it. They love bodily functions. They don't care which bodily function it is. They're into it. So it kind of depends on your market a little bit, right? But I know in science fiction there are agents and editors who flatly refuse. It's a very personal decision. They just flatly refuse to do anything that has a lot of very visceral puking, and it's ironic because I have a slide later on that's going to go into a little bit more, but I'm just using that as an example of like a red flag scenario I've seen where an experience could be too dug in a little bit, right? So you kind of gotta like finesse it, right? It's based on the purpose of your story, what you're trying to communicate, because remember, stories are tools of communication. Whether something is going to be a distraction or not, if it distracts, you're going to most likely lose the reader. You're going to suspend their disbelief, and there's that. How many people have read Les Miserables, the original Les Miserables by Victor Hugo? Did you enjoy those 100 pages of sewers? 100 pages of sewers, 100 pages of Covenant, and then 100 pages on the Battle of Waterloo. Completely not related to the main story. So if you read the short version, you get those cut out, right? So there are literary layers, like the fact that we have Jean Valjean, we have Colette, we have Fantine, we have their stories. Those are the literary layers, the 3 different stories that are interwoven with Marius, right? They're interwoven together, creating this vastly rich idea of what it's like to be one of the miserables of Paris, right? And then we've got the espousing layers talking about the setting and detailed levels that really is not interesting to any modern reader of any time. Hence the musical is so popular and the novels not so much. I didn't really need to know so much about the lives of rats in the sewers of Paris while I'm waiting for Fantine to get better or not, right? So we're talking, you gotta kind of have some judicious use, but the layers are really critical because it paints a much broader picture. It's not just one miserable person in Paris, right? It's at least 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, dozens of miserable people in Paris during that period of time. And those layers add a richness that really helped me believe and understand what it was like to be miserable in Paris in those 1800 periods, right? And that full picture, that full resound experience persists and gets people reading this story on and on and on and on over and over again. Yes? We're good? Layers? Pretty easy. Don't worry, I believe you all use layers in your work. Not doubting anybody here. Okay. Contradiction. So, we talked about consistency, right? Guess what? We're going to be contrary with contradiction. So, a person or a thing or a situation in which inconsistent elements are present. Well, I'm here to throw a whole... It's equal, right? So consistency and contradiction. Life is full of paradoxes, right? We've experienced this. We've all lived life. And because life is full of paradoxes and things don't always make sense, or they don't make sense, but then it makes perfect sense. This is something that's very human in our experience. And so when we're talking about contradiction, we're kind of adding that element into our painting a realistic picture for our narrative in our fiction, right? And if you don't have contradiction, people start wondering a little bit, like, how can everything be so perfect? Like, how did it all just go so well? Without, like, how can somebody be so consistent all the time? The lack of contradiction also makes it really difficult to enact change in your story. And stories are all about change. So contradiction is actually really critical in that aspect, because we use contradiction as a way to kind of like push and pull things. It's like two different elements that contradict each other. That battle is what kind of forces change into our story. And really what we're talking about is like characteristics or action that produce a natural gap that pique the audience's interest and helps them relate to their own lives. We need that gap, okay, between, you know, what people say and what people think. We see that gap a lot, and a lot of times they're contradictory, yeah? Yes, we think one thing, we say something else. Does that happen to people? I'm going to assume everybody's done that. So I'm using an example here of Han Solo, who's considered one of the greatest, like, you know, contradictory characters of cinema. The first one was Frodo, and I've talked enough about hobbits, so we're going to go with Harrison Ford. He's better looking, anyways. So when we meet Han Solo, who's seen Star Wars? Please everybody raise your hands. Okay. Original trilogy, right? OG? Yeah, okay. The best one. I'm going to say it on camera. So, in A New Hope, we meet Han Solo, right? And he's kind of a scallywag, right? Not particularly nice dude. Pretty mean to Luke, actually. Very sarcastic. Doesn't seem like he's in it for anybody but himself and Chewbacca, his giant walking dog. So, Han Solo does not seem like the kind of person that's going to dedicate himself to the rebellion. In fact, he says so several times throughout the film. Like, why are you doing this? Who's this princess? Why should I risk my skin? You know, the rebellion is poor. And it's not until Luke's like, she's rich. He's like, oh, okay, fine, right? It really doubles down on the idea that Han is in it for himself and the money. But what happens by the end of the film? Does Han take his money and go? He does not. He does exactly what he said he wasn't going to do, which is come back and rescue Luke, right? That doubles down in the second film, in Empire Strikes Back. There's literally nothing in it for Han. Nothing in it for Han. In fact, he's risking his neck by staying with the rebellion instead of paying off Jabba the Hutt. That doesn't go so well for him. He turns into a coffee table by the time we're in the third film. So we have a really contradictory character. Han Solo consistently doesn't make any sense. How many people have seen the new films? Can I spoil the latest trilogy for you? Even by the end, even when the time that Han finally gets taken down, it makes no sense. It's like, okay, you had a son, and then the son turns bad, and then you ran away, but then you meet some random girl, and you've come back, and then you let your son kill you. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, Han is all over the place when you sit down and think about it, right? That could also be bad writing. But, like, the point stands that he's consistently contradictory. Weird, right? But him being consistently contradictory, how many people's favorite character is Han Solo in the Star Wars trilogy? A lot of people like Han Solo. It's not just because Harrison Ford is really handsome. I'm sorry, I prefer him as Indiana Jones myself. But as a character, Han Solo is often considered the most believable character because he's the most human. And he's the most human because he's so contradictory. He has this gap. And he has this gap that really keeps us engaged in his character all throughout the film, to the point it doesn't matter what he does, we're into it, right? Like, he cannot go wrong, even though he's always wrong. Leia is always right. So, this is how it ends up working. So, he's much more believably real than Leia or Luke. Those two are so holier than thou, we put them on a pedestal, but they're almost like gods or goddesses. They're not humanistic like Han. So Han is the one that we really gravitate towards when we want to talk about the human moments of Star Wars. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah? Consistently contradictory. Moving on the same theme. Error and flaws. The state or condition of being wrong in conduct or judgment. I hate to say this, I read this a lot. I meet a lot of very perfect characters. Now, that's not to say that the characters are not flawed. They often have flaws. But what I mean to say is that even in their flaws, they often always make the right choice, even though they have flaws. So, we're talking about errors and flaws in a mark of fault or an other imperfection that mars a substance or object. What I'm saying is, to err is human, right? To err is human. We are human. We make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes all the time. I should have left my house 20 minutes earlier. I would have been here earlier. We make mistakes all the time. Not having a character that never makes a mistake immediately breaks our suspension of disbelief. Yeah? Does that make sense? If someone always makes the right choice, even under extreme duress, we're going to have a really hard time relating and believing in that character. I have two great Hansen examples on the screen. One is Superman, Henry Cavill, good-looking guy, English. And he was a perfect casting for Clark Kent, also known as Superman. Superman is a very old character. Very popular. I don't know how many people know about the history of Superman. He rose up in the 1920s in the comic book series. Yeah. At the time, what was going on in the 1920s? The Great Depression, right? So audiences latched on to Clark Kent, not because he was Superman, but because an ordinary newspaper man could become Superman, right? Now, what's happened, let's just say 100 years later? Well, Superman's kind of become the embodiment of perfection, right? And as a result, DC has a really hard time making him relatable to audiences. I don't know how many people have kind of noticed. If we just look in terms of money, because that's the only metric I have, how much more money has MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, made over the DC films, right? It's a massive difference in billions of dollars, degrees of billions of dollars. Superman in today's modern era is just not really that relatable. He's just too perfect, right? They have to really work hard at giving him imperfections and flaws to make him relatable to audiences for such a long period of time. They did a very clever job in this version of Superman. So what did they do? They turned his amazing superpowers against himself. How many people watched Man of Steel? It was really clever. They basically turned his super hearing, super vision, super strength and everything as a negative. And they had to learn to control those powers. So like his hearing would go so wild, he couldn't actually walk through the room because it was so overwhelming. Sensory overload. That's how they did it. They gave him this flaw to make him make more sense to audiences. Okay? So even someone like Superman they have to create a flaw for him, even though these are core characteristics of who he is, in order to give him something to overcome. Because we love people that overcome things, right? Now we got the other side. I would say, Superman's rival in the MCU, who is Iron Man. Iron Man does not need to come up with more flaws. He's got so many, he can jump all the way up to the skyscraper, right? Iron Man is full of flaws. Tony Stark is such a... I wouldn't want him as my boss, let's put it that way, right? So Iron Man has a lot of flaws. But as a result, what has happened? Tony Stark is extremely relatable, right? We look at him and we look at his flaws and we see his arrogance, right? We see his overconfidence, we see his mistakes, his trauma, and we as audiences really relate to him. Is Tony Stark any more realistic than Superman? Than Clark Kent? Absolutely not. But do we as audiences believe that Tony Stark is much more real than Superman? Absolutely we do. It's weird, right? There's no mega genius making robot suits that can fly around the car with microcomputers. This does not exist, And yet, we believe that there could be a real Tony Stark somewhere out there. They thought he was Musk. He wasn't. But we believed in that. We don't believe that there's this perfect flying, X-ray vision, responsible, all-American boy who's English hero saving us from buses and cats or whatever it is. We don't believe in Superman, but we do believe in Tony Stark. It's a very odd situation. You had a question?
I just noticed that they cast Robert Downey Jr. as the Iron Man with all these flaws, because even Robert Downey Jr. has some really bad flaws.
Absolutely.
He's trying to overcome.
Absolutely.
And I think that's interesting casting.
Absolutely. The casting in MCU is actually one of its highlight parts, and the casting is really good, but you are absolutely correct. They casted an actor who came with a lot of flaws. He came with a lot of drama, right? And actually, spoiler, I don't know if anybody here knew this, but during the filming of Iron Man, at the very, very end, you know, he comes up to the pulpit, much like me, and he goes, they're like, who is this Iron Machine, and blah, blah, blah. Robert Downey Jr. was supposed to deny that. And he just goes, I am Iron Man, right? And it has a huge explosion. That was not scripted. That was ad-libbed by Robert Downey Jr. And that one line changed the entire MCU because it got rid of secret identities. There's no secret identities in MCU because Robert Downey Jr. was like, Tony Stark wouldn't say that. He's arrogant. He's flawed, right? He loves the pulpit. He loves the attention. So he said he had Iron Man declare that he was Iron Man, and that changed everything. There's lots of little Easter eggs in all of MCU about this, but that's one of the big things that Robert Downey Jr. had done, and that had been a huge. We're going to go into ad-lib lines, going back to contradiction over here. Han Solo has a very famous line that was also ad-lib, right? Yeah. Princess Leia goes, I love you. And he goes, I know. Right? But think about the line. Harrison Ford came up with that line. And why did he come up with that line? Because his character is contradictory. Okay? Does Han Solo love Leia in that moment? Yes, he does. He absolutely loves Leia. But it's not in his character to be very upfront about his feelings. So even though he loves her, and he's about to die as far as he's concerned, he doesn't tell her the truth, because he can't. That's not in his nature. And so for the consistency of the character, Harrison Ford says, I know. And George Lucas sat on that for 2 weeks before he let it in, because that is the nature of the character, consistently contradictory. Yeah, it became one of the most famous lines in film history. Okay, specificity. You thought it was all going to be MCU and space stuff? Well, too bad. I'm sorry, folks. I love Pride and Prejudice. So specificity is the quality of belonging or relating uniquely to a particular subject, right? I like this particular form of Pride and Prejudice. That's just me. So we're going to go into this a little bit. So the devil is in the details. We've heard this phrase? Yep, devil's in the details. The more specific information we can give the reader, the fuller picture we can paint for them, which in turn helps bridge that sensory gap, right? Specificity also allows readers to take a bigger and bigger cognitive leaps, especially if all the other characters in the story also believe in those details. This is really critical in science fiction or fantasy, right? There's a force. There's no such thing as the force. But all the characters believe in the force or in the process of believing in the force. And because they're in the process of believing in the force, they take us characters along with the audience along with them, right? To the point where we believe like, oh, you know, I do this at the when the doors open, automatic doors, I'm like, Rrr. Even McGregor does this, he's like, Rrr, every time the door is gonna open in the elevator. It's like, yeah, I'm the force. There's no force, right? But because everybody else believes in this phenomenon, we believe in it too. Okay, so the nice thing about specificity is it's a principle that can be applied to all aspects of the craft. In particular, we see a lot in word choice, or wordsmiths, right? You gotta be kind of specific about your words. But the word choices have to stem from something else. We have to give reasons for those particular word choices, right? And the more reasons we can give for those the more reasons we can give for specific word choices, the more we can get the audience to buy into those choices. Does that make sense? It's like math. I can give you the answer as to why the circumference is 9, but if I show you my work, I'm really driving it home, right? So these are all tools to really show the proof of work in those principles, whatever you're trying to convey to the reader. So we really got to fill in those sensory gaps, and it's important in the details, and that they got to work off of it. So I'm going to use this image as an example. You've got women standing outside. It's true, right? There are 5 women. They're standing. We didn't even say 5, just women standing outside. Doesn't tell us much, does it? I mean, we know what women are. We know what standing is. We know what outside is. That's all I'm giving the reader. It doesn't really evoke anything, right? But if I say something like, the 5 Bennett sisters look over a Neverfield house balcony. Well, we get a lot more information. First of all, we got 5 sisters. That's a lot of sisters, okay? And they're all clearly doing something in a rather fancy house. So we've got an idea of the setting, right? We've got an idea of the family. And our interest is a little bit more piqued because it's like, well, what were these 5 sisters like? What's their dynamic like? What kind of feelings are they having while they, lean over this balcony? And where is this house? And what significance does it have for these 5 sisters? It's not their house. If it was their house, it would be sitting there, five sisters standing over the balcony of their house, but it's not their house. So where is Netherfield? And if we take it even deeper, we look at the 5 sisters themselves, you notice that Jane Austen was really careful about the details to differentiate between them. It's really quite specific, right? So we have Jane, who's basically the older pretty one, right? She's like the almost alternate mother figure of the 5 sisters. And then you have Elizabeth, who is very clearly described to be just as beautiful as Jane, okay? But clever. So you're very specific to say she's just as pretty, but also smart, and she's also feisty, as opposed to Jane is a lot more, even keel, easygoing kind of nature, very demure, where Elizabeth is not demure at all, right? So Jane Austen's very careful to tell you where they're similar with these 2 older sisters, but also very careful to tell you where they're different. Then there's 3 younger sisters. They also have all their distinct traits. Lydia is rambunctious and spoiled, and she's the youngest, like the youngest would be, right? Rambunctious and spoiled. Kitty has a weak personality and pretty much follows Lydia's lead, right? And then Mary is the middle child, and boy is she the middle child. She's plainer than her sister, she's not quite as good looking, and she tries really hard to compensate by having more accomplishments than she actually has talent. As a result, she feels rather discontent because really no one appreciates Mary. It's kind of sad. She really doesn't want to be involved with the flirting and the dating and all that kind of nonsense her other sisters are involved in. So when you put all these details together, you get a really authentic picture of the Bennet family life, right? One household, 6 women. We haven't even included the mom. 6 women and 1 man, right? There's a lot going on. It doesn't matter what time period you're in. 6 women in 1 household with 1 dude is a lot. And then, on top of that, Jane Austen's very careful to present details about their income, what their father does, what the mother does, how they occupy their time, where they live, all these other things, to make them very relatable. We get a very full picture of what Regency era England is like, and the circumstances and the culture in which these 5 sisters are interacting with, right? And thus it becomes very believable that the only outlet for these women to kind of get out of the situation that they're in is to marry wealthy, right? That's kind of like the full-on thing that they do. When I was a kid, I thought Jane Austen was weird. How can people be so obsessed with these books that are just about girls marrying dudes? Like, that's the entire premise of every single Jane Austen book, is about a woman finding a man. As a kid in, the 1990s, I was like, whoa, like we women's rights, right? Like what, how is this like your whole identity is based on your husband? It's a bit of a stretch. But when I sat down and finally read these books, I realized, oh my goodness, no, it's so much more than that. This is so relatable. Not because that the end goal is marrying a man, but because it's about finding your place in the world and empowering yourself and being who you are and navigating these really complicated social situations. So the way the books specify the distinct situations of every single woman presented, every single woman has a very specific situation within this Regency era England, it becomes really relatable for audiences. And critically, the same details of the story of Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters has remained relevant for societies 200 years later. None of us are marrying daughters to Mr. Darcy nowadays, and yet we still get the same story and premise as the foundation of romance, right? So Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, these are Mansfield Park, these are all mainstay stories. Every single one of them are very similar in a lot of ways, and yet completely different from each other. And those details really make the difference and make them very believable as individual, unique women. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So specificity really lends to believability. Exaggeration. Okay, so we talked about the gap, this gap we're going to just keep going on about, which is our lived sensory experience and what we read off the page, right? Exaggeration is a really critical tool for now. But this one comes directly from animation, except I didn't use an animation example. Essentially, we're talking about the goal of what believability is supposed to do, which is to make something feel realer than real, right? It's supposed to transcend reality into believability, okay? But to do that, we have to punch up elements. And why is that? It's because there's that sensory gap, right? We have to trigger emotional responses in the mind of the reader so that they can fill in those sensory gaps for me, the writer, right? I don't know, I'm very sensitive maybe. When I watched animation mainly because I couldn't watch live action. If I watched 007 and somebody got shot, I felt the shot. I don't know if anybody else has ever had that, where they like feel the pain, or they get really sick to their stomach when somebody looks like they're motion sick, they're very like in tune with the film. That happens to me a lot. I use animation because there's like a drawing, I don't feel the impact of the drawing. But in the case of like, I actually really struggled to watch this movie for this reason. This is Saving Private Ryan from 1998, directed by the great Steven Spielberg. Yes? How many people have seen the film? Okay. If you are queasy at all, I don't recommend it. But if you can handle it, I do recommend it. It is an amazing piece of film. And so we're going to talk about, everybody knows about World War II, yes, in Omaha Beach? Yeah? Okay. D-Day? D-Day. D-Day, Omaha Beach, the Allied forces are coming and they're going to go and land on France and they're going to, try to take out Hitler during the whole World War II thing. Omaha Beach is one of the beaches that they operated on. And based on the accounts of the veterans who had fought on Omaha Beach, it was a miserable time, right? It was a really awful, terrible battle. I actually had a professor or a teacher who had been there. And he was British Indian, so not American, but he was on the British side. It was a miserable time. Okay, 1998 is Saving Private Ryan. That's when the film comes out. Why is Saving Private Ryan so significant? It's very simple. Up until 1998, when we did war films, we gave a very sanitized version of war films. They were very pretty, they were very clean. There's a lot of drama, contortion on the face, but it wasn't nitty-gritty at all. It was just very much like a sanitized, clean, digestible version for audiences to be able to take. Steven Spielberg didn't really like that. When he was doing research for Saving Private Ryan, he talked to the actual veterans, and all the veterans had asked him, please, 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 tell the real story of what happened on D-Day. Don't paint a sanitized, cleaned up version. It's disrespectful to the people who died and gave their lives up for this battle. So Steven Spielberg went, okay, I'm going to do my best. And this is what he came up with, the Omaha Beach scene. So, Omaha Beach scene, it's very visceral. I'll give you a Cliff Notes version. They're shooting inside the ships that are gonna land. It's rocking, right? Soldiers are standing, they're like this. A lot of them are puking, sorry. There's a lot of vomiting, there's a lot of people getting sick to their stomachs, there's a lot of people shaking. They're terrified, and they should be. They were terrified. You're going into enemy territory. They knew that the Nazis had barracks and they had huge fronts that they're gonna have to fight, and the people who were at the front, absolutely, you are the first ones that are gonna get shot. They knew a lot of them were not gonna make it out of there, but they did it anyways, okay? They did it anyways. So, that bravery, we're showing the bravery of what it's actually like, because people are sick to their stomachs and terrified, but they're doing it anyway. So we get a really raw sense of that bravery. And then you get the boat opening up, the soldiers are charging forward, despite the puking 2 minutes ago, right? They're charging forward, they don't even make it. Some of them drown into the ocean, they get crushed by the boats, they're puking, the blood guts everywhere, right? Screaming everywhere. Okay, so, it's pretty visceral. It's quite a long sequence. It's like 12, 15 minutes long, right? I had a professor who watched it, the one that had been there, and he said it was the realest, closest thing to actually being there as you could get. The thing about it is, if you talk to an actual historian, they will say that's not what D-Day was like, right? It wasn't actually. Omaha Beach was 3.5 miles long. So what's happening on one end of the beach is not happening on the other end of the beach. What the Omaha Beach scene in Saving Private Ryan shows us is the worst part of the battle. The absolute worst, horrifying, the thing that's like the bottom of the bottom, you do really terrible. And it's given us 15 minutes when it wasn't even that long, right? It's giving us more than what we asked for, more than what actually happened. And the whole reason it's doing that is so when the audience is sitting there, literally captured audience, you're just completely overcome with this visceral sense of horror and despair and agony for these soldiers and an admiration for their bravery, because it has been war turned up to the nth degree, right? That exaggeration is what makes it so believable that even the veterans who had been there, who hadn't actually been the ones to be in this particular part of the beach, they had PTSD. They had to call a hotline and talk to therapists set up by the Veterans Association to handle the situation because it was so bad for them. Okay? So, this is an example of punching it up so that you can elicit an emotional response that's realer than real. Right? They are watching a fictional account of an experience that they actually lived through. And that fictional account triggers them so hard that they have to go and seek help. Not really an advertisement for the film, but a great example of what I'm talking about. When we talk about exaggeration, creating a sense of realer than real. So you really have to punch things up, right? We really got to, and we have a term in that film. It's like, what was it? I forget. But there's like, we have a term in film where we have to take it up a notch, right? You always got to put it up a notch because creating that will elicit a higher emotional response. That the brain will create a higher emotional response that's closer to real. Because the brain can only ever make a shadow of your lived experience, right? It can't fully replicate it 100%. If you think of it like an opacity bar, right? What you experience in life at the time is 100%. But in your memory, it's never 100%, right? In memory, it's always like 80% if it's recent, 50% if it was a year ago, 20% if it was, 20 years ago, and then probably 5% if you were a kid, because I don't remember what I was like when I was 5 either, right? So your words, the exaggeration, the specificity, all those things, they have to basically make up for that opacity, to at least try to get that opacity as high as possible. It's never going to be 100%. We can get close, right? We can get 60%. 60% is better than 40%. 80% is better than 60%. The better you can get that, and the more you can trigger that experience, the closer you can fill that gap, the more you're going to get the audience to believe that what they're reading is real. Pacing. Okay, this is a really odd focus because, again, this is really coming out from animation. If you talk to veteran animators, one of the key critical differences between great animation and somebody's learning is what we call timing. The timing of how we move things, right? Because it's like, it's all math, gotta count it. So in story, this is also kind of true with pacing. You can really tell when people are pacing things, because time is a really strange thing. We're trying to right now prove that time doesn't exist. I find that hard to believe. Time does kind of exist, right? But we, at least for humans, we have a sense of time. We have a sense of passage of time, okay? And you can't let that go, because everybody kind of experiences time. And you'll also know everybody experiences time differently. How I'm experiencing time right now is going to be completely different than how you're experiencing time right now. Okay? Which is going to be completely different than how a fly experiences time right now. Which is going to be, again, going to be different how the tree experiences time right now. Or a turtle. Or anything. So anything with a time sense is going to experience it differently. And our individual ways how engaged we are is going to really change our sense of time. Okay? So it's like a rhythm or pacing, right? It's like music. You have different types of music, and different pacing of music will elicit different emotional responses. Storytelling will do something similar. If you read Steven Spielberg's On Writing, he talks about it a little bit, where like words have this amazing magic to be able to teleport you into a different realm of time and space, where the author kind of gets to dictate what that feeling of time is going to be. Okay? So that's what we talk about pacing, and pacing is sort of relevant through all aspects. Pacing is especially relevant through plot, right? How quickly your plot moves. Does it move? Please make it move. So how quickly your plot moves, and whether that speed jives with what the actual plot point is, right? Or how quickly does a scene move? We're all adults in the room, right? Me waiting in the doctor's office is gonna have a very different sense of time than me, finally get a confession from Mr. Darcy, right? I'm still waiting. So we're gonna have a very different feeling of how time flows. So that is also a chemical response. Actually, a lot of it is subject to adrenaline in your mind, right? You have adrenaline that we're gonna elicit a fight or flight response, and how you experience time really shifts once those chemicals hit your bloodstream, okay? So this is my example, right? Basically, it's like any day. Let's just say it's today. You all are sitting here, and your phone rings. Phone ring, right? I'm riffing. And you pick up the phone. You're like, oh, right now, right? Like I'm in the middle of this lecture, and then it's your spouse has been in an accident. my sense of time is going to go wonky at this point, right? Because now time has stood still. My spouse has been in an accident. What kind of accident? Where did this accident happen? Are they okay? Are they still alive? Oh, suddenly your mind is like racing at incredible speeds, but time has slowed down almost to a stop, right? And then you're like, okay, they didn't tell me, they just said get to this hospital now. And you're just like, oh my God, now suddenly time is way too slow, right? The first hit is like, time is frozen, but mine has gone a mile a minute, and now they're like, go to Marin General. I'm pretending we're in Marin. Go to Marin General. It's a 15-minute drive. That 15-minute drive might as well be an hour and a half, right? It's so slow. Me trying to get here, so slow, because I'm in such pressure to get here. Time is suddenly really, really slow. And in the meantime, you have way too much time for your mind, which is going way faster than the rest of your body, to think about all the horrible things, like what could have happened? Did he get bit by a snake? Did a tree fall on top of him? Both those things have happened. Not the snake biting, but like snakes have happened. Did a tree fall on him? Did the car have an accident? Was there like some kind of like paint can fall down? Was there a ladder issue? Like what happened? All of a sudden I'm filling my mind all that time. It's 15 minutes with all these imaginary horrors, right? And then you get to the hospital and you find out it was just a fall. It was just a fall. What? Right? Now suddenly time is like sped up again. It's a fall. You fell and you just sprained your ankle and you're going to be fine. Oh my God. And now all of a sudden I look at the clock, it's 2 p.m. Oh, they got this phone call at 10 a.m. and now suddenly it's 2 p.m. Where did the time go? And now I've got to rush to get through all this other stuff that I need to do, right? I got to pick up the kids. I got to somehow find his medication. I got to cart this dude home. I got to figure out what's going to go on the second car. Now I don't have enough time, right? So, pacing. Pacing is the sense of speed by which you give the audience an understanding of what's happening in the story. Is there urgency? Is there not urgency? If it's boring, you kind of want to describe a lot of things, right? Give a slow moment, like in Middle Earth when Bilbo Baggins is smoking his pipe. He's not under any sense of urgency, right? He's just there having a good time with Gandalf. So it's not particularly a fast moment. But then when all of a sudden, there's dragons coming out, everything suddenly moves really quick, right? So you have a pacing of things, and you have a pacing of the events too, as well. And you have to make sure to give the reader enough time to keep up with what you're doing. If you move the story along too fast, the reader can't keep up. And if they can't keep up and they lose the details, the specificity you put in, you just get confusion. And I hate to break it to you, as a spoiler alert, confusion leads to a suspension of it breaks the suspension of disbelief. When people get confused, they don't know what's going on anymore, they lose that train and everything snaps, and they're out of the book. So, pacing is really important. You have to be really cognizant to how your own chemical lived experience and how you gauge time goes with the story. If I'm going to do, let's just say, a multi-generational saga about Korean, Japanese people, like in the book Pachinko, right? It's going to be slow. That's a massive book. It's like 1,000 pages. It's a very slow book. It's multi-generational life thing. Shogun, very similar. It's not the fastest paced book in the world, right? As opposed to J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. Boy, that thing is so fast I cannot keep up with it. Everything moves extremely quick, short little volume. Because why? Well, the lived experience of one boy, over the course of those, I think 3 months, is what Catcher in the Rye covers. Really fast, right? Everything is on hyper adrenaline. He's going quick, he's moving through life this fast, he's making really quick decisions. So my example here is kind of similar. It's the not, curse-filled version, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That's a film, it's like 2.5 hours long, right? Covers one day. I got even better for you. The film Titanic goes longer than the actual Titanic sinking, right? I think it was longer by 40 minutes. Thanks, James Cameron. So our sense of time is really conflated, right? What we cover, how much it goes. You can have a really huge story happen in 24 hours, or you can have a really long story, but you have to kind of pace it along, like a piece of music. Are you a symphony? Are you a concerto? Are you a rock moment? You gotta kind of go together. If I was doing an opera, let's just say, and I decided to squeeze that opera into one 3.5-minute and sing song, probably not gonna go so well. It's too much information, not enough time, right? If I'm gonna sing my love story to my ex, because I'm angry on my ex, probably 1.5 minutes is enough. Nobody needs to hear you go on about your ex, right? So, a similar kind of understanding of like how we pace music to how we pace books. You kind of got to make it consistently work, right? We got to make it drive together. And that will, you want to get your time sense to snap with the reader's time sense. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's why pacing, very critical. And it's on all aspects, between the scene, from the scenes, the sentences, or from the sentences to the scenes, to the chapter, to the novel, or to the arcs, to the novel. You want to pay attention to how the elements you're introducing are paced into that scene, how you've written it. Sorry, I'm going to be running on time a little bit. So weighted decision making. Decisions made with careful consideration, especially by balancing opposing factors or aspects to reach a choice or conclusion. Basically, you want to evaluate before you make your choice. Weighted decision making is super, 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 super critical. Why is that? Because I'm a firm believer that stories are made up of critical character decisions. Essentially, your characters go through life or go through the story and they have choices, right? And what their choices are going to define how your plot is going to roll out, right? Does Alice go left or right? Does she eat the big mushroom, the little one? Doesn't matter. It's going to make a decision on how her journey through Wonderland goes, right? Now the thing about weighted decision making is that the characters actually have to think about their choice. That's really all I'm asking for. You just want to have the character think a little bit about their choice, and what their thoughts are should factor into the decision. It's showing your work. If the story is making the characters go through critical character decisions, then we want to show the work of why they come to the conclusions of what they come with. Because by showing your work, we are convincing the audience that yes, this decision makes sense to that character during that critical moment in time. Yes, does this all make sense? So I put up an example of The Matrix's 1999 film done by the Wachowski sisters, right? They are sisters. They are sisters. And they were brothers at the making of this film, but they are now sisters, which is for the fourth film. I know. It's okay. Wikipedia will help you. So here we have. So who's seen The Matrix? I hope everybody's seen. Hello, Mr. Anderson. Yeah. Okay. So Thomas Anderson is our main character, played by the very handsome and popular Keanu Reeves. Big fan. And he's presented. This is a critical moment for Thomas Anderson. Yeah, he's being presented with a red pill and a green pill. I'm going to spoil the movie for you a little bit. Okay? And what has been happening to Mr. Anderson before he's presented this choice? He's being given a choice here. And basically, it's been weird for him. He's a software engineer, I believe, in the story. And during the day, at night, he's a hacker. He styles himself as this alternate name, Neo, right? Okay. So Neo's a hacker at night and a software engineer in the day. Well, during the day, all of a sudden, weird things start happening to him. This other hacker named Trinity has hacked into his work computer and starts talking to him, right? And describing this thing called the Matrix. And he's been writing to this term a lot online. And he's like, what is this thing called the Matrix? And then after Trinity makes contact with him, describing or talking about something about the Matrix. I don't know, it's been a long time since I've seen the movie. But anyways, I know Trinity was involved. A bunch of agents start showing up at his work, right? Mr. Smith. And all these guys, black suits, black glasses, sometimes lives in Middle Earth. But these agents start coming after him, and he's like, what the what? Right? Thomas Anderson is very, very confused. But he's running because Trinity is like, run, right? So he's running. And as he's running, he meets up with Trinity. She's appealing, right? And she's trying to save him. And these agents are really after him, right? And he starts noticing really strange things. Like she's making phone calls, phone booths are doing things, black cats are walking twice. It doesn't make any sense. Really strange stuff starts happening to him. And in the process, he gets captured, right? There's a scene where he gets captured by the agents, Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith's like, hello, Mr. Anderson. And Mr. Anderson's like, what's going on, right? But in the process of this questioning, Mr. Smith seals Mr. Anderson's mouth. It is very bizarre.
Yeah, I remember.
Right? Very bizarre. Big CG moment. That was CG. Really big. And then they put a bug in his gut. Whoa, got weird fast, right? And now he's like, something is really wrong. And he wakes up. And he's just like, was that a dream? Was that a nightmare? What just happened to me? I have no clue. right? And then what happens again? Trinity comes in contact again, and she's just like, come with me to meet this man named Morpheus. And he's just like, he doesn't know what's going on. But she's hot, he's going. So he goes and he meets Morpheus, and Morpheus tells him the strangest story in the world. You are not living in the 1990s. This is not real. You're in this thing called the Matrix. It's an alternative simulation of the 1990s peak humans so that the robots who have taken over the world can use us humans as human batteries. I don't know about you, that sounds very far-fetched. Okay? And Anderson is sitting there like, what? Right? And he goes, I can show you the truth. You can take one of these two pills. The red pill is going to take you to the real world. But if you take the green pill, you're just going to go right back into your normal life. Spoiler, Neo takes the red pill. Snaps out of reality, wakes up, he's got plugs all over him. Sure enough, he's been a human battery. Okay, but why does he make the red pill choice? Now, let's picture an alternative version of life, okay? Let's say Mr. Anderson here had a normal day. He woke up, had his coffee, went to work, went about his business, did his hacking at night, ate a donut maybe, you know, had a date, didn't work out, went home, pet his cat, met Trinity, she asked him for coffee, and her friend Morpheus, and then he goes to bed. The next day he wakes up, it's Saturday, he meets Trinity, they finally scheduled a live meetup, right? He's hoping. She's still hot, but she's not in her full get-up Matrix gear, right? She's just in her black biker gear, let's just say. They have coffee, and she's like, hey, do you want to meet my friend Morpheus? And he goes, okay. She's hot, right? They go meet Morpheus. Morpheus is like, hey, look at these pills I got. You're in an alternative reality in one of these, okay? One of these will take you out of this alternative fake reality, and this other one's going to take you back to your normal life. What pill do you think Neo's going to take? He ain't going to take the red pill. Why? There's no reason for him to believe that this is an alternative reality. If he takes the green pill, maybe he'll snap back into the reality where him and Trinity are together, right? So like there's no motivation for him really to take the red pill in our second scenario. Nothing is going to happen, right? Because there's no need for him to really weigh his decision. There's no need to consider anything, really. His normal day is his normal day. He's no alternative. We humans like to be comfortable. Now, let's change the camera a little bit. Let's talk about you, the audience. Let's say you're the audience, you're watching this, and you haven't seen the original Matrix. This is alternate version boring Matrix, right? And so you're sitting there, you're watching this, and he takes the red pill, and you go, why? Why would he take the red pill? I would not take the red pill. I don't want to deal with some like mass murder robots out in the real life when I can be perfectly comfortable in here. Yeah. That doesn't make any sense. Then what happens? Immediately, boom, your suspension of disbelief is gone. And it becomes very, very hard to get back into it, right? We, at that point, are all like, we're on green pill side, dude. Why are you doing this red pill side? There is no support for this red pill decision. Okay? So when we're talking about weighted decision making, we're talking about you really have to think about the history and the context, the culture, the setting, the overall details of your story, the specificity of their personality. I'm struggling with that word. Their contradictions, their flaws. You have to consider all those things so that the character makes a decision that makes sense to them. That decision has to make sense to them. Because if it makes sense to them, it will make sense to the audience. If it doesn't make sense to them, it's not going to make sense to the audience. And if it doesn't make sense to the audience, I hate to tell you, the audience loves to be smarter than us. And they'll be like, screw this, I'm out of here. You know? So that's why weighted decision making is super critical when it comes to the believability of your story. Yeah? And sometimes the realistic decision is not the right one. Because the realistic decision usually yields to no story, because it's usually the boring one. We, as humans, don't like to put ourselves in danger. Okay? We don't want to experience danger in real life. We love it when other people experience danger. We are voyeurs as humans, right? We love it. Somebody else has to clean up a giant Twinkie truck turnover truck. I'm not going to get involved. I'll eat the popcorn and watch, right? Like, we love other people's drama. We don't want to be involved ourselves, right? And I will absolutely sit down and watch those people clean up those Twinkies, just for the fun of it, right? That's what Twitter was so successful at. We love to watch other people's drama. We don't really want to be involved in our own. So don't worry about the realism of the decision, right? Just make it so it's believable so that you can get the reader to keep eating that popcorn, to get hooked on the story. Because then they're going to want to know what's next. Okay, subplots. Our last one, yay! Subplot is relatively easy. So a subordinate plot in fiction or drama. I used Romeo and Juliet as my example. A lot of people argue about whether or not there's a subplot Romeo and Juliet, but I just went with it because I figured I'd go with the classic. Romeo and Juliet, what's the story really about? The story is really about a boy named Romeo falling in love with a girl named Juliet. It's pretty, well, it's Shakespeare, so it's very dramatic, right? It's a very dramatic love. The part that makes it interesting is the fact that it's a forbidden love. Yeah, one's a Montague, the other one's a Capulet. These families are in rivalry together. Technically speaking, the rivalry between the Montagues and the Capulet is the subplot. Okay? Because when you think about it, there are situations really have nothing to do with the main characters at all. Like, for example, the fight between Mercutio and Tybalt, right? Romeo doesn't want to be involved at all. If anything, he's actively choosing to not be involved with this fight because he wants to get with the girl Juliet, right? And through a set of circumstances, the subplot decided, no, you don't get to stay out of this, and the subplot rolled the main plot into it. Now Romeo's involved with this mess that he's trying to clean up so he can get with his girl Juliet, who's still his main interest throughout the entire thing. So the subplot of this story ends up really kind of rolling into this, and it kind of makes the whole the tragic story that we know of as Romeo and Juliet. So why is this relevant to believability? It's because as much as I would love to be able to sit home, go home and cook dinner without any interruptions, my children have decided that I must be involved with their subplot. I have to know about the fall in the playground and how they didn't eat the lunch and how, Giuseppe wasn't so nice today and somebody pushed him from behind. I'm just trying to cook dinner, dude. You're going to be hungry in about 5 minutes. That's the main plot. You're not going to let me go by with that, are you? Nobody really gets to do anything without interruptions. That's the reality of situation. And by introducing that element into your writing, you'll create believability because nobody is allowed to do anything without interruptions. The subplot exists to show what other waters are churning around me, right? And that's a really critical aspect of storytelling. Even if it's something very small and insignificant, there are always subplots. In film, we call them B stories, C stories. They also have to tend to be resolved by the end of the plot. If you don't resolve it, you have these things called plot holes. Nobody likes plot holes. But if you do them well, the subplot will tie into the main plot in a way that will really elevate your narrative and also really make it feel very real, right? If we're going to go back to the Les Mis example, the real story is Jean Valjean, right? Jean Valjean is the main character of Les Miserables. Yes, it's an ensemble story, but really it's about Jean Valjean and him stealing a loaf of bread, and him being cast out by society for stealing this loaf of bread, and him finding redemption, right? Him falling, he's going to go murder somebody for some silver candlesticks. Finding redemption and his path towards redemption despite all the temptations. Les Miserables is about Jean Valjean. And yet, we have these other critical subplots in the form of Fantine and Marius, the Revolution, all these other things. And those subplots all enhance Jean Valjean's journey. It shows up in critical moments. He didn't save Fantine in time. She has her own thing going on, right? She's been cast off by the man she fell in love with. She had an unwanted child. The child had to leave. There's a whole thing with the really terrible innkeepers who have a great catchy song. There's a whole, Fantine's got her own saga, right? Colette's got her own saga. Marius has got his own saga. They all have these massive subplots that exist kind of on their own. They could be novels by themselves, and yet they're not. They're all subplots to this main journey of Jean Valjean, right? So having those subplots just means that there's other stuff going around in the world, and those things can't affect my main plot, whether I want them to or not, right? And that in turn is very believable. It's very realistic because all of us live lives where we're constantly interrupted. We're constantly having other things that we have nothing to do with affect us, right? So that's why we have to introduce subplots into your story. If you don't, it gets very thin. If we did not have the subplot of the, what are they called again? The Capulets and the Montagues in Romeo and Juliet, the story would be very boring and also very trite, because who really wants to see two teenagers fall in love at a party for like 90-minute Shakespearean play? Not that many people. We're not that keen on it, right? We've all been there. None of us need to see it again. It's very cringe. But add the forbidden love aspect of it because of the background of this family, and so we have the context, the history of the family, the history of the characters, the context of the family, the consistency of their hatred for each other, right? The details of who the relationships are and how they interact with each other. The decisions Romeo makes, not great ones. The decisions Juliet makes, not great ones. All interacted, stemming from the subplot, okay, that enhances the richness of the main plot. Suddenly the romance is pretty interesting. You know, it's lasted 500 years. I guess it'll go another 100 or so. And that in turn becomes an enduring classic. Does that make sense? And it becomes believable and relevant to our audiences even in modern day. I mean, I know everybody wants to write everybody writes Romeo and Juliet kind of esque romance story at some point, right? About rivalry, hated parents, or parents that don't like the other side. The monster-in-laws, basically, right? So this is a very believable aspect of it. Okay? Yeah? So there you have it. 12 principles of believability. Setting, consistency, history, positive effect, layers, contradiction, philosophy. This is our list of what I've developed over these years. Questions? Anybody have any questions, comments, critiques?
Excellent.
All the way in the back. We'll go with you first, sir.
So first, totally fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
Marvelous.
Thank you, thank you.
And this was great.
Thank you.
Best line of the day, the Han Solo turned into a coffee table. I don't know if that was spontaneous or not. You've used that before, and I don't want you to tell me that. And then the third thing is, maybe with a follow-up, is if you're driving 15 minutes to go ahead and get to Marin General, from Marin, what town would you be leaving from?
Fairfax. Fairfax, that's where I live currently, sort of. I'm actually in transition.
So you and your kids have been M&G's and had French fries there with the sauce.
Yeah, absolutely. My children love all the sauce.
Yeah.
I'm actually in the process of leaving the country. You guys are like my last audience in America. Yeah. I know. I'm moving to Northern Ireland.
Oh,
I'm talking about my own story. So you guys are kind of my last American audience. Yes, ma'am.
do you have suggestions about setting in nonfiction?
Setting in nonfiction is really going to come down to details. So when you're talking about nonfiction stories, it's going to come down to the specificity of the situation, the context by which the story is being told. Because in nonfiction, the critical aspect is the uniqueness of the situation or the uniqueness of the story that's being conveyed. And setting can really change based on what your topic is. I read Seabiscuit, which is a nonfiction story, and the setting shifted constantly. Yes, Seabiscuit is a Californian horse. Yes, the whole thing was trying to win the 100 grand race in Santa Cruz. I forget which race it is. Santa Cruz, yes? Santa Cruz, whatever, whichever race it was, it's in Los Angeles. But the story jumps all over the place because the jockey spent a lot of time in Tijuana, not great times. The farm that Seabiscuit was based in is actually nearby here, right? He's in the Bay Area. The owners and their lives started in San Francisco. So the setting is very much specific to the events. The way the story is structured is to really present the context and history of the horse and how he came about, right? A completely different nonfiction book, The Billionaire's Vinegar. How many people have read this one? It's about this bottle of wine. It's actually a bit of a mystery story of this bottle of wine that had been auctioned, supposedly owned by Thomas Jefferson. And the setting is all over the map based on what information is being conveyed to give a round picture of this antique wine world, which is wild. There's this antique wine world out there, really rich people with way too much money, not enough to do, who invest all their money in antique wines. And so it's like the context of their parties, which wines they get them from. A lot of them come from World War II bunkers, underground wine bunkers that the French had made during the war. But then the person who had made the bunker didn't survive the war, or they forgot where the bunker is, and there's only evacuated, there's all these antique wines, and there's auctions, and the settings and the parties. So it really comes down to the place, but critically the time. So for setting in the case of nonfiction, time is a really big factor. You really have to be very specific about the time, and you have to paint what that time period was like, right? So if you read like Nelson Mandela's A Walk Home, I want to say, and the context by which he's telling that story, he's very careful to tell you, at this time, in this moment of my life, I was doing this. And at this time, in this moment of my life, I was doing that. And at this time, in this moment of life, I was doing this. And so that is the really critical information that you have to convey with nonfiction. Context, 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 super important. Any other questions? Did you have a question in the back? No?